Hello, my name is Ahnaf and welcome to the React for Beginners series. In this video, I'll be talking about how you can get rid of the boilerplate code and put in your own stuff in the React app. And I'll be also talking about how the structure of a React app works and how you can configure everything. So in the last video, we have left off at the point where we have this default React app from Create React App, and we are running this with Yarn or npm, whatever you want to use. So open up VS Code or your favorite editor in that folder, and what you'll see is you will see three folders. One is node modules, one is public, and the other thing is src. And then you also have gitignore, package.json, readme, and yarn.lock. But we are only interested in the src directory for now. So let's open up index.js, and when you run yarn run or npm run, whenever you start a React app, it basically targets the index.js file. So in the index.js file, you see a lot of code, and here we have react dom.render app. So this is the app component, and then we have document.getElementById root, and this is JSX code. So by using document.getElementById root, basically we are going to the public directory and we are selecting the div with the id root, and basically all of your React content will be inside this directory. So we can just go to index.js, and here we are rendering the app component. Now this is what React DOM does. As I've explained in the last tutorial, React uses a virtual DOM to render everything up, and React DOM is basically that representation of the virtual DOM, and it's basically just rendering the app component in the root div. Now we also have some other stuff, which is like report web vitals, and this is not really important when you're developing a small application. It's only important when you're when you want to measure the performance of your app, and you can just log results and stuff. So let's remove it for now, and if we save it, nothing happens. So we can just remove this from the import. It's basically importing report web vitals from this report web vitals.js file. So we can remove this, and let's delete some unnecessary stuff that we don't need. We'll start everything from scratch. Now let's remove index.css. Basically it's importing the index.css the CSS code, and if we remove the CSS code from here and save it, okay, never mind, yeah. So if we remove the CSS code and refresh, basically you see that none of the font code or any of this is working. Now we can we don't need to mess with any one of these, because we are importing the app component from here, and the app component is basically the whole page. So let's go to the app component here, and this is basically how a component works. Now let me explain first. So when you create a component, you make it a function or a class. We'll be talking about class-based components later on, but the most modern way to make components at the moment is with functions. So we have a function called app, and basically a component must return some JSX. This is not HTML, this is JSX. Now as I've said before, JSX is really similar to HTML, but there are slight differences. For example, instead of using class, we have to use class name, because class is a reserved keyword for JavaScript. It's used for creating classes in the code. So instead of class, we use class name. And then we also have imported an image, which is basically the logo.svg, and in the source of the image we can embed some objects here. So in this case, the object is the logo, and we are just embedding objects with curly braces. So this is basically how embedded JavaScript in JSX works, but I'll be explaining those later. For now, let's just delete everything we don't need. So let's remove the logo, the CSS. Let's just remove this whole div and stuff. Let's just remove the test files, because we don't need these. Let's remove all these stuff that we don't need. We also don't need this and this. So we're only left off with two stuff, the app.js and the index.js. So what if we remove this and hit end and hit save? Now if we refresh, it's going to say element type is invalid. You know why? Because we're importing app from /app. It's trying to find app.js and import the app object or anything that's called app here. But in the app.js file, we don't have anything. So let me show you how you can create a really basic component. So the first thing you need to do is to import React so that the JSX works. So let's do import React from React and put a semicolon. Now JavaScript is very forgiving. It doesn't actually require semicolons, but I just like to put it, and it's a good practice. Now that we have imported React, let's create a function. Now, as I've said before, you can create functions in two ways. I mean, not functions, I mean components. You can create components in two ways, by either making a function or making a class. So the most modern way is using functions, so let's make a functional component, and let's do function app, and it doesn't take anything here for now. And let's return some JSX. So return in brackets div, and let's return something like h1 hello world. If we save this, it still doesn't work because it doesn't contain a default export, so we need to export the component as default. Let's do export default and the name of our component, so app. Now if you hit save and then refresh, it's showing hello world. Now I apologize for killing your eyes because we programmers hate light mode, but when you're just starting off with hello world, the background is going to be white. So this is how you create a really simple component in React. Now let me show you how you can create an arrow function. So we could just make an arrow function called const app, and basically in the same way we could just return we could return a div and then an h1 hello, this is a functional component. And if you hit save, so right now I have Prettier installed, which is an extension, and it is used to make your code look better when you save it. Now you can install it in VS Code. I think Atom also has a Prettier extension, but whatever. So this is basically how you make a React component, and the index.js just imports this component from here and then just renders it out over here. So this is really simple, and this is JSX. So in JSX, not only can you write HTML-ish code, you can also like use your components. You can render your own components. So this is a functional component, and you can see we got this. Now let's talk about how we can create our own components. So creating a component in React is really easy, as I've showed you over here, but let's create a component from scratch, which we can put inside this component. So in React, the concept of component nesting is like, it's literally a basic thing. You can put components inside components, and that's what makes React awesome. So to create a component, we can create a component literally anywhere in the src directory, but for better organization, let's create another folder called components, and in the components folder, let's create a component called mycomponent.js. But instead of using JS, we put JSX, and let me tell you why. You see, when you write your React component, by default, it doesn't like have support for JSX if it's a JS file. But if you put JSX at the end, npm or like the Babel compiler, it understands that, okay, this file is not a typical JS file. It has JSX inside, so it is treated a bit differently. And that is why it's always good to put .jsx at the end of any React component. So we have this file called mycomponent.jsx, and now let's create a really simple component here. Let's do import React from React. Now that we have imported React, let's create a function called function, and yeah, we can do function myComponent, and then just return a div. And one thing about React component is that it always has to return a wrapped element. So for example, What I mean by that is you can't just return a div and then another div. So these are like, so basically returning two different stuff. This is one element, this is another element. You can't return two independent elements. You have to wrap them inside another div. So inside this div, you have to wrap these two, or else you'll get errors. So if I remove this, and if I save this, you see it's showing like JSX expressions must have one parent element. And right now it's not showing errors because we haven't imported this component into our code. So let's just put it like this, and let's create an h1. So let's do h1, and this is my component. Okay, so this is our h1, and now let's export this with export default my component. Now, one thing with React components is that it always must return JSX, and it should have one parent element. So that's basically a rule to creating components. So now that we have our own component, we can go to app.js, and now let's import our component. So let's do import my component from /components. You can't just do components. You have to do /components, or else like JS will think that you're trying to import something from node modules, and then if it doesn't find anything called a component package, it'll just throw an error, cannot find module called components. So that's why I do /components, or the name of your folder, anything, /my component. So once we save this, we can now put our component inside our app component. So this is how you put a component. So in your app component, you put a div, an opening tag, and then you put the name of your component and then the closing tag. But this is how you import your component, but this doesn't look good. So what you do is all components must have a closing tag. Okay, so if it doesn't have a closing tag, you could just put a slash like at the end of it. Okay, so this is basically how to do it, and now it doesn't show an error. So now if we save this, and if we hit refresh, contain a default export. I'm pretty sure we exported this. Yeah, my bad. So now you can see it's showing this is my component. So we have created our component here, and in the app.js file, we're putting our my component here. And now, as I've said, since components are usable and independent, we could just put this component like as many times as we want. We can save it, and now it's showing the same thing. This is my component, and blah blah blah. So this is basically how components work in React, and it's really simple. Components is what makes React awesome. Now let's talk about importing CSS. So let's create a simple CSS file called index.css, and let's hit enter. And now we could put some style, for example, body and font family would be, let's do something like this to go UI, Toma, Geneva, Vadana, and sans serif. So this is our font, and now we could just import this div in our, import this CSS in our app.js, or we could just import it for a component. So let's import this CSS, like import /index.css. I think it would have been better if we renamed it as app.css. Now let's put app.css. If we save it and refresh, no need to refresh, you see the font has changed. Now this is a different font. But if we don't import this, if we save it, you see this font looks weird, and now if we import this, we got our font. Now we could also do something like text align, or we could do something like h1 text align center, and now you see it's all centered because h1 elements are block elements, so it just covers the whole place and it's in the center. So this is basically how CSS and React components work. Now this was a really short video, but I hope this video explained the core basics of React, how you can create your own components, import CSS, and we also deleted all of that boilerplate code and started our own stuff. And from the next video, we will start working on our to-do list app, and I will be going over all of the React concepts. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to subscribe and like. You can also dislike if you don't like it. So yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video.